So, hello and welcome back yet again to another evening with Ivanhoe, where, like I said, I'm pretty sure we met this universe's version of Robin Hood, or what will become Robin Hood and his band of merry men. Now I'm wondering if the peasant who has been challenged to an archery competition might not be the same master of bandits slash Robin Hood. Kind of curious about that. Also, I got a new chair along with a new desk yesterday, along with a refrigerator and a dresser and a bar cart and an electric organ and a TV. I made out like a bandit yesterday, and I appreciate my neighbors so much. The house that this is coming from is the same house that you guys have seen it in older videos if you've been around for a while. It's my neighbor across the lake who her husband died, and then she moved in with her family, and my son and I went over there and took care of Peaches and Parky for about a year. And then when it turned out that she was going to be staying down with her family, we adopted Peaches and Parky. And then about 6 months after that, she died, and my other neighbor actually bought the house that she lived in, mostly to keep it wild and isolated, but they're now cleaning out that house. So Parky, I think, appreciated this chair. He's kind of been sleeping in it since I brought it in the house. I think it smells like his old home, and I think he likes that, which is kind of sweet and kind of sad. But he's doing fine. Anyway, none of that has anything to do with Ivanhoe, which is why we are here in this extremely comfy reading chair that I'm very excited about. I also need to find chapter 12 because I somehow managed to lose my bookmark, because that is exactly just how that goes. That's 11. Ah, there we go. I just had it marked on the wrong page. So we're going to be jumping back into Ivanhoe. Do not forget, I will not be seeing you for reading books again until Monday, but that's okay because this is a really long chapter. This is a much longer chapter than I thought. But yes, if you would like, tomorrow I am going to be live streaming probably The Sims. You never know, I might do a little bit of Phasmophobia at the end. I've been playing that a lot. It's a ghost hunting game where, unfortunately, a lot of times I say bad words because ghosties, but it's a lot of fun. I might stream it a little tiny bit after I finish my Sims build. But that is what I'm going to be doing tomorrow night. You're more than welcome to join me. As always, thank you to my two patrons on Patreon, Hazel and... let me go check the name. Okay, my two patrons, Deanne and Hazel. I had to go double check because you ever do that thing where you look at something and you don't write it down because you say you're going to remember it, and then you sit down and turn on a camera and completely blank? That's what just happened to me. One of these days I'll get a nice little card or something that does a thank you to patrons, but thank you to Hazel and Deanne, my two patrons. I did put up a free short story on Patreon that's free to anybody who wants to check it out. It's the very first short story I did. I can't really guarantee the audio quality on it because I did record it outside so that you could see birds landing on my finger, but it's there if you want to go and watch it. Anyway, we're going to jump in and read something from Chaucer at the beginning of this chapter, and then we're going to jump into chapter 12 of Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. And I'm sweating again because I spoke too soon about it being autumn. The heralds left their picking up and down, now ringing trumpets loud and clarion. There is no more to say but east and west, in go the spears sadly in the rest. In goth the sharp spur into the side, There see men who can't just and who can't ride. There shiver shaftets upon shields thick, he feeleth through the heart's bone the prick. Up springin' spears 20 feet in height, out go the swords to silver bright. The helms they go to hewn and to shred, out bursts the blood with stern streams red. And that was Chaucer. And I'm not gonna lie, that was very chewy language. Please don't ever ask me to read Chaucer. But now, chapter 12 of Ivanhoe. Morning arose in unclouded splendor, and ere the sun was much above the horizon, the idlest, or the most eager of the spectators, appeared on the common, moving to the lists as to a general center in order to secure a favorable situation for viewing the continuation of the expected games. The marshals and their attendants appeared next on the field, together with the heralds, for the purpose of receiving the names of the knights who intended to just, with the side of which each enclosed or chose to espouse. I'm going to do that sentence again. The marshals and their attendants appeared next on the field, together with the heralds, for the purpose of receiving the names of the knights who intended to just, with the side which each chose to espouse. This was a necessary precaution in order to secure equality betwixt two bodies who would be opposed to each other. According to due formality, the disinherited knight was to be considered as the leader of the one body, while Brian de Bois Guilbert, who had been rated as having done second best the preceding day, was named the first champion of the other side. Those who had concurred in the challenge adhered to his party, of course, excepting only Ralph de Vipont, whom his fall had rendered so unfit as to be unable to put on his armor. There was no want of distinguished and noble candidates to fill up the ranks, though, on either side. In fact, although the general tournament, in which all knights fought at once, was more dangerous than single encounters, they were nevertheless more frequented and practiced by the chivalry of the age. Many knights, who had not sufficient confidence in their own skill to defy a single adversary of high repute, were none the less desirous of displaying their valor in general combat, where they might meet others with whom they were more upon an equal playing field. On the present occasion, about 50 knights were inscribed as desirous of combating upon each side, when the marshals declared that no more would be admitted, much to the disappointment of several who were too late in preferring their claim to be included. About the hour of 10 o'clock, the whole plain was crowded with horsemen, horsewomen, and foot passengers hastening to the tournament, and soon thereafter a grand flourish of trumpets announced Prince John and his retinue, attended by many of those knights who meant to share in the game, as well as others who had no such intention. About the same time arrived Cedric the Saxon with the Lady Rowena, unattended, however, by Athelstine. This Saxon lord had arrayed his tall and strong person in armor in order to take his place among the combatants, and, considerably to the surprise of Cedric, had chosen to enlist himself on the part of the Knight Templar. The Saxon, indeed, had remonstrated strongly with his friend upon the injudicious choice he had made of party, but had received only that sort of answer usually given by those who are more obstinate in following their own course than strong in justifying it. His best, if not his only reason for adhering to the party of Brian de Bois Guilbert, Athelstine had the prudence to keep to himself. Though his apathy of disposition prevented his taking any means to recommend himself to the Lady Rowena, he was none the less by no means insensible to her charms, and considered his union with her as a matter already fixed beyond doubt by the assent of Cedric and her other friends. It had therefore been smothered displeasure that the proud, though indolent, Lord of Coinsborough, beheld the victor of the preceding day select Rowena as the subject of that honor that it had been his privilege to confer. In order to punish him for a preference which seemed to interfere with his own suit, Athelstine, sure of his strength, and to whom his flatterers at least told that he had great skill in arms, decided not only to deprive the disinherited knight of his powerful succor, but if an opportunity should occur, make him feel the weight of his battle axe. De Bracy and the other knights attached to Prince John, in obedience to a hint from him, had joined the party of the challengers, John being desirous to secure, if possible, the victory to that side. On the other hand, many other knights, both English and Norman, native and stranger, took part against the challengers, the more readily that the opposite band was to be held by so distinguished a champion as the disinherited knight had proven himself. As soon as Prince John observed that the destined queen of the day had arrived upon the field, assuming that air of courtesy which sat so well upon him when he was pleased to show it, he rode forward to meet her, doffed his cap, and alighting from his horse, assisted the Lady Rowena from her saddle, while his followers all uncovered at the same time, and one of the most distinguished of them dismounted to hold her palfrey. "It is thus," said Prince John, "that we set the dutiful example of loyalty to the Queen of Love and Beauty, and are ourselves her guide to the throne which she must this day occupy. Ladies," he said, "attend your queen as you wish your turn to be distinguished by the same honors." And so saying, the prince marshaled Rowena to the seat of honor opposite his own, while the fairest and most distinguished ladies present crowded in after her to obtain places as close as they could to their temporary sovereign. No sooner was Rowena seated than a burst of music, half drowned by the shouting of the multitude, greeted her new dignity. Meanwhile, the sun shone fierce and bright upon the polished arms of the knights on either side, who crowded the opposite sides of the lists and held eager conferences together, discussing the best mode of arranging their line of battle and supporting themselves in conflict. The heralds then proclaimed silence until the laws of the tourney should be rehearsed. These were calculated in some degree to abate the dangers of the day, a precaution most necessary, as the conflict was to be maintained with sharp swords and pointed lances both. The champions were therefore prohibited to thrust with the sword, and were confined with striking. A knight, it was announced, might use his mace or battle axe at his pleasure, but the dagger was prohibited. A knight who was unhorsed might renew the fight on foot with any other on the opposite side who was in the same predicament, but mounted horsemen were in that case forbidden to assail those on foot. When any knight could force his antagonist against the extremity of the list, so as to touch the palisade with his person or arms, that opponent was obligated to yield himself as vanquished, and his armor and horse were placed at the disposal of the conqueror. A knight thus overcome was not permitted to take farther share in the combat. If any combatant was struck down and unable to recover his feet, his squire or page might enter the lists and drag his master out of the press, but in that case the knight was adjudged vanquished, and his arms and horse forfeit. The combat was to stop as soon as Prince John should throw down his leading staff or truncheon, another precaution usually taken to prevent the unnecessary shedding of blood by the too long endurance of a sport this desperate. Any knight breaking the rules of the tourney, or otherwise transgressing in the rules of honorable chivalry, was liable to be stripped of his arms, and having his shield reversed, be placed in that posture astride the bars of the palisade, and exposed to public derision, in punishment of his unknightly conduct. Having announced these precautions, the heralds concluded with an exhortation to each good knight to do his duty, and to gain favor from the Queen of Beauty and Love. This proclamation having been made, the heralds withdrew to their stations. The knights, entering at either end of the lists in a long procession, arranged themselves in a double file opposite to each other, with the leader of each party being in the center of the foremost rank, a post which he did not occupy until each had carefully arranged the ranks of his party and stationed every person in their place. It was a goodly, and at the same time an anxious sight to behold so many gallant champions, mounted bravely and armed richly, standing ready and prepared for an encounter so formidable, seated on their war saddles like so many pillars of iron, and awaiting the signal of the encounter with the same ardor as their generous steeds, which by neighing and pawing at the ground gave their signal of impatience. As yet, the knights held their long lances upright, their bright points glancing to the sun, and the streamers with which they were decorated fluttering over the plumage of their helmets. And thus they remained, while the marshals of the field surveyed their ranks with exactness, lest either party had more or less than the appointed number. The tale was found to be complete. The marshals then withdrew from the lists, and William de Wyvil, with a voice of thunder, pronounced the signal words, "Laissez aller!" The trumpets sounded as he spoke, and the spears of the champions were at once lowered and placed in the rests. The spurs were dashed into the flanks of the horses, and the two front ranks of either party rushed upon each other in a full gallop, and met in the middle with a shock the sound of which was heard from a mile away. The rear rank of each party advanced at a slower pace to sustain the defeated and to follow up the success of those victorious in their party. The consequences of the encounter were not instantly seen, for the dust raised by the trampling of so many steeds darkened the air, and it was a minute before the anxious spectators could see the fate of the encounter. When the fight became visible, half of the knights on each side were dismounted, some by the dexterity of their adversary's lance, some by the superior weight and strength of the opponents who had borne down on both horse and men. Some lay stretched on the earth as if never again to rise, and some had gained their feet and were closing hand to hand with some of their antagonists who were in the same predicament. And several on both sides, who had received wounds by which they were disabled, were stopping up their blood with their scarves and endeavoring to extricate themselves from the melee. The mounted knights, whose lances had almost all broken in the fury of this encounter, were now closely engaged with their swords, shouting their war cries and exchanging buffets, as if honor and life depended upon the issue of this combat. The tumult was presently increased by the advance of the second rank on either side, which, acting as a reserve, now rushed to aid their companions. The followers of Brian de Bois Guilbert shouted, "Ha! Vinciant! Vinciant! For the temple! For the temple!" The opposite party shouted in answer, "Desudado! Desudado!" which watchword they took from the motto upon their leader's shield. The champions thus encountering each other with the utmost fury and alternate success, the tide of battle seemed now to flow towards the southern, then towards the northern side of the lists, as one or the other party prevailed. In the meanwhile, the clang of the blows and the shouts of the combatants mixed fearfully with the sound of the trumpets, and drowned out the groans of those who fell and lay rolling defenseless beneath the feet of the horses. The splendid armor of the combatants was now defaced with dust and blood, and gave way at every stroke of the sword and battle-axe. The plumage, shorn from the crests, drifted upon the breeze like snowflakes. All that was beautiful and graceful in the martial army had disappeared, and what was now visible was only calculated to awake terror or compassion. Yet, such is the force of habit, that not only the vulgar spectators, who are naturally attracted by sights of horror, but even ladies of distinction who were crowding the galleries saw the conflict with a thrilling interest, but without a wish to withdraw their eyes from such a terrible sight. Here and there, indeed, a fair cheek might turn pale, or a faint scream might be heard, as lover, brother, or husband was struck from his horse, but in general, the ladies around encouraged the combatants, not only by clapping their hands and waving their veils and kerchiefs, but even by exclaiming, "Brave lance! Good sword!" when any successful blow or thrust took place that they were watching. Such being the interest taken by the fairer sex in this bloody game, that of the men is definitely better understood. It showed itself in loud acclamation upon every charge of fortune, while all eyes were so riveted upon the list that the spectators seemed as if they themselves were dealing and receiving the blows which were so freely being bestowed. And between every pause was heard the voice of the heralds exclaiming, "Fight on, brave knights! Man dies, but glory lives! Fight on! Death is better than defeat! Fight on, brave knights! For bright eyes behold your deeds." Amid the varied fortunes of the combat, eyes of all endeavored to discover the leaders of each band, who, mingling in the thick of the fight, encouraged their companions both by voice and deed. Both displayed great feats of gallantry, nor did either Bois Guilbert or the Disinherited Knight find in the ranks opposed to them a champion who could be termed as their unequaled match. They repeatedly endeavored to single out each other, spurred by their mutual animosity, and aware that the fall of either leader might be considered as decisive of a victory. Such, however, was the crowd and confusion that during the early part of the conflict, their efforts to meet were unavailing, and they were repeatedly separated by the eagerness of their followers, each of whom was anxious to win honor by measuring the strength of him against the leader of the opposite side. But when the field became thin by the numbers on either side who had yielded themselves as vanquished, or been compelled to the extremity of the lists, or otherwise been rendered incapable of continuing, the Templar and the Disinherited Knight finally met in hand to hand, with all the fury that mortal animosity, joined by rivalry of honor, could inspire. Such was the address of each in parrying and striking that the spectators broke forth into an unanimous involuntary shout expressive of delight and admiration. But at this moment, the party of the Disinherited Knight had the worst, the gigantic arm of Front de Bœuf on the one flank, and the ponderous strength of Athelstine on the other, bearing down and dispersing those immediately exposed to them. Finding themselves freed from their immediate antagonists, it seemed to have occurred to both of these knights at the same instant that they would render the most decisive advantage to their party by aiding the Templar in his contest with his rival. Therefore, turning their horses at the same moment, the Normans spurred against the Disinherited Knight on the one side and the Saxon on the other. It was utterly impossible that the object of this unequal, unexpected assault could have sustained it, had he not been warned by a general cry from the spectators, who could not but take interest in one exposed to this disadvantage. "Beware, Sir Disinherited," was shouted so universally, that the Disinherited Knight became aware of his danger, and striking a full blow at the Templar, he reined back his steed at the same moment, so as to escape the charge of Athelstine and Front de Bœuf. These knights, therefore, their aim being thus eluded, rushed from opposite sides betwixt the object of their attack and the Templar, almost running their horses against each other before they could stop. Recovering their horses, however, and spinning them around, the whole three pursued their united purpose of bearing down the Disinherited Knight. Nothing could have saved him, except the remarkable strength and activity of the noble horse that he had won the preceding day. This stood him in the more stead, as the horse of Bois Guilbert was wounded, and those of Front de Bœuf and Athelstane were both tired with the weight of their gigantic masters, clad in full armor, and with the preceding exertions of the day. The masterly horsemanship of the Disinherited Knight and the activity of the noble animal which he was mounted on enabled him for a few minutes to keep at sword's point his three antagonists, turning and wheeling with the agility of a hawk upon the wing, keeping his enemies as far separate as he could, and rushing now against one and now against the other, dealing sweeping blows with his sword without waiting to receive those which were aimed at him in return. But although the lists rang with the applause of his dexterity, it was evident that he must at last be overpowered, and the nobles around Prince John implored him with one voice to throw down his warder and to save so brave a knight from the disgrace of being overcome by these odds. "Not I, by the light of heaven," said Prince John. "This same Springle, who conceals his name and despises our hospitality, hath already gained one prize, and may now afford to let others have their turn." As he spoke thus, an unexpected incident changed the fortune of the day. And I'm going to go grab a drink. I'll be right back. Okay, drink obtained. There was among the ranks of the Disinherited Knight a champion in black armor, mounted on a black horse, large of size and tall to all appearances, and powerful and strong, like the rider to whom it was mounted. The knight, who bore on his shield no device of any kind, had before now evinced very little interest in the event of the fight, beating off with seeming ease those combatants who attacked him, but neither pursuing his advantage or assailing anyone. In short, before now he had acted the part of a spectator rather than that of a party in the tournament, a circumstance which procured him among the spectators the name of Le Noir Fainéant, or the Black Sluggard. At once this knight seemed to throw aside his apathy when he discovered the leader of his party so hard bested, for, setting spur to his horse, which was still quite fresh, he came to assistance like a thunderbolt, exclaiming in a voice like a trumpet call, "Decidado, to the rescue!" It was high time. For while the Disinherited Knight was pressing the Templar, Front de Bœuf had gotten nigh to him with his uplifted sword, but before the blow could descend, the Sable Knight had dealt a stroke upon his head, which, glancing from his helmet, lighted with violence scarcely abated on the chamfron of his steed, and Front de Bœuf rolled to the ground, both horse and men equally stunned by the fury of this blow. The Black Knight then turned his horse upon Athelstane of Coinsborough, and his own sword having been broken in his encounter with Front de Bœuf, wrenched from the hand of the bulky Saxon the battle-axe which he wielded, and like one familiar with the use of this weapon, bestowed upon him such a blow on the crest that Athelstane also lay senseless on the field. Having achieved this double feat, for which he was the more highly applauded than was totally unexpected, the knight seemed to resume the sluggishness of his character, returning calmly to the northern side of the lists, leaving his leader to cope as best as he could with Brian de Bois Guilbert. This was no longer a matter of so much difficulty as it had been before. The Templar's horse had bled a lot and gave way under the shock of the Disinherited Knight's charge. Brian de Bois Guilbert rolled upon the field, encumbered with the stirrup from which he was unable to remove his foot. His antagonist sprang from horseback, waved his fatal sword over the head of his adversary, and commanded him to yield, when Prince John, more moved by the Templar's dangerous situation than he had been by that of his rival, saved him from mortification of confessing himself vanquished by casting down his warder and putting an end to the fight. It was indeed only the relics and embers of the fight which continued to burn, for of the few knights who still continued in the lists, the greater part had by tacit consent forborne the conflict for some time, leaving it to be determined by the strife of the leaders. The squires, who had found it a matter of danger and difficulty to attend their masters during the fight, now thronged into the lists to pay their dutiful attendance to the wounded, who were taken off with the utmost care and attention to neighboring pavilions or the quarters prepared for them. And thus ended the memorable field of Ashby de la Zouche, one of the most gallantly contested tournaments of that age, for although only 4 knights, including one who was smothered by the heat of his armor, had died on the field, upwards of 30 had been desperately wounded, 4 or 5 of whom never actually recovered. Several more were disabled for life, and those who escaped best carried the marks of the conflict to the grave with them. Hence, it is always mentioned in the old records as the gentle and joyous passage of arms at Ashby. It being now the duty of Prince John to name the knight who had done the best, he determined the honor of the day remained with the knight who the popular voice had named Le Noir Faitant. It was pointed out to the prince that an impeachment of this decree, that the victory had in fact been won by the Disinherited Knight, who in the course of the day had overcome 6 champions with his own hand, and who had finally unhorsed and struck down the leader of the opposite party. But Prince John stuck with his own opinion, on the ground that the Disinherited Knight and his party had lost the day, except for his powerful assistants. And so the Knight of the Black Armor, therefore, was going to get the prize. To the surprise of everyone, though, the knight thus preferred was nowhere to be found. He had left the lists immediately when the conflict had ceased, and been observed by some spectators to move down to one of the forest glades with the same slow pace and listless, indifferent manner which had given him the name the Black Sluggard on the field. After he had been summoned twice by the sound of the trumpet and the proclamation of the heralds, it became necessary to name another to receive the honors which had been assigned to him. Prince John had no further excuse for resisting the claim of the Disinherited Knight, who, therefore, was named as the champion of the day. Through a field slippery with blood and encumbered with broken armor and the bodies of slain and wounded horses, the marshals of the lists again conducted the victor to the foot of Prince John's throne. "Disinherited Knight," said Prince John, "since by that title only will you consent to be known to us, we a second time award to you the honors of this tournament, and announce to you your right to claim and receive from the hands of the Queen of Love and Beauty the chaplet of honor which your valor has justly deserved." The knight bowed low and gracefully, but returned no answer. While the trumpet sounded, while the heralds strained their voices in proclaiming the honor to the brave and the glory to the victor, while the ladies waved their silken handkerchiefs to embroidered veils, and while all the ranks joined in a clamorous shout of exultation, the marshals conducted the Disinherited Knight across the lists to the foot of that throne of honor which was occupied by the Lady Rowena. On the lower step of this throne, the champion was made to kneel. Indeed, his whole action since the fight had ended seemed rather to have been upon the impulse of those around him rather than his own free will, and it was observed that he tottered as they guided him the second time across the list. Rowena, descending from her station with a graceful, dignified step, was about to place the chaplet which she held in her hand upon the helmet of the champion, when the marshals shouted with one voice, "It must not be. His head must be bare." The knight muttered faintly a few words which were lost in the hollow of his helmet, but Their purport seemed to be the desire that his mask might not be removed. Whether from love of form or curiosity, the marshals paid no attention to his expressions of reluctance, but unhelmed him by cutting the laces of his casque and undoing the fastening of his gorget. When the helmet was removed, the well-formed, sunburned features of a young man of 25 were seen, amidst a profusion of short blonde hair. His countenance was as pale as death, and marked in a few places with streaks of blood. Rowena had no sooner beheld him than she uttered a faint shriek, but at once summoning up the energy of her disposition and compelling herself as though to just proceed, all the while her body trembling with the violence of emotion, she placed upon the drooping head of the victor the splendid chaplet which was the desired and destined reward of the day, and pronounced in a clear, distinct tone these words: "I bestow upon thee this chaplet, Sir Knight, as the meed of valor assigned to this day's victor." Here she paused a moment, and then firmly added, "And upon brows more worthy could a wreath of chivalry never be placed." The knight stooped his head and kissed the hand of the lovely sovereign by whom his valor had been rewarded, and then, sinking a bit farther forward, lay at her feet. There was general consternation. Cedric, who had been struck mute by the sudden appearance of his banished son, now rushed forward as though to separate him from Rowena, but this had already been accomplished by the marshals of the field, who, guessing the cause of Ivanhoe's swoon, had hastened to undo his armor, and found that the head of a lance had penetrated his breastplate and wounded him in his side. And that is the end of the chapter. It was actually a little bit shorter than I thought. Also, if this is following the whole Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, Robin Hood Men in Tights, then our Black Knight is probably King Richard. I don't know, because I've never actually read Ivanhoe, but I'm betting. Also, yeah, we knew that it was Ivanhoe. But now we know that it's Ivanhoe, so that's kind of exciting. So thank you, as always, for listening. I hope that you enjoyed that. Sorry about the little mess up in the beginning there. I just read the sentence, didn't actually have it penetrate and make it so I understood what it actually said, so decided I better rewind and do that again. But yes, as always, thank you so much for joining me. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I will see you for more of Ivanhoe on Monday.